kind of exciting, Liz. You're going to get us going.
I'm going to get you going. You can use this little clicker.
Okay.
So it's that one moves forward.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a few things that I'd like to talk to you about. First of all, the July session, it's on July 11th, and the library has conflict. They have a speaker coming in. That afternoon was the only time that they could get that speaker, so we can't have our afternoon session. So I guess we're voting on whether you would like to have a morning session rather than an afternoon session. We'll still have the evening session at 6 o'clock, but the 2 o'clock session, we won't be able to have that. So is anyone interested in having the session at 10 o'clock in the morning? We've got a few hands up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so we've got enough interest that if we change it to 10 o'clock, people will show up, right? Okay, we'll do that. And the other thing I wanted to let you know about is that the Master Gardeners are going to be having our spring fling where we bring in a speaker, and that's going to be on the 21st, Tuesday, the 21st, and it's going to be out at Joe Dean's. And if you'd like to pick up a little flyer before you leave, that would be great. But Christine Lang, who is one of the professors at SDSU, is going to be coming in and talking about integrating edibles in your flower beds. So it should be a real fun kind of session. And that again is on the 21st out at Joe Dean's at 7 o'clock. And then I wanted to let you know that Sioux City is going to have a big event, I guess we'll call it, on the 31st of March and on the 1st of April, so Friday the 31st. And we have the schedule of who's going to be there. I don't have ones to give out to you, but it looks like they're going to have a great program. And it's Friday the 31st and April Fool's Day.
Website
and
go to.
Where's it going to be?
It's at the Marriott Center in South Sioux City, or the Marriott Event Center, I think it's called. I'm not sure. But the website is on there. I think it's Siouxland Garden.
Yeah, it's Siouxland Garden Show.
.org, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't have the.
Doesn't it have it on there?
The Siouxland Garden Show.
I think it's down.
No, it doesn't tell me where it is.
You can probably just Google
But
it.
if you go on Siouxland Garden Show and look it up, it's on the 31st and the 1st. So that's our business to take care of. Marlis was good enough to step in for Wayne. Wayne had some family medical things that he had to go to. So we have a change in speakers, and Marlis is our hero because she stepped in kind of the last minute to do the session. So thank you so very much. We do have seeds. If you filled out a form and got your seeds, great. If you still want seeds, let us know. We just got in our tomato and pepper plants on Friday.
Seeds.
So they're over at the prison. They'll be packaged. We'll have them next month to give out. So we've got, I think, 4 kinds of tomatoes. There was cherry tomato, big tomato, Roma tomato, and another tomato, I think. And we've got 4 peppers. We've got red pepper, yellow pepper, jalapeno, and an Anaheim pepper. So we'll have those next month to give out, and those will probably be pretty close to exactly when you should be starting them, because it's 4 to 6 weeks before our last frost date is when you should start them inside. Our last frost date, is May 15th-ish. I think the last 2 years, we've had a frost right around the 15th. Yes. So it's probably even a little early to be thinking of putting them out on the 15th, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
I think last 2 years, right?
Yeah, the weather is, it's all over the place.
Yeah, we had really, really warm weather, and then right at the 15th, it got really cold last year. And I really don't remember the year before, but
Same thing.
Yeah, and I know that. Yeah. So Marlis is gonna talk about, and this is scientifically based, this isn't Farmer's Almanac kind of information.
Yeah.
This is all, someone's done research on companion planting, and so this is not Farmer's Almanac. My great grandmother did this and it worked for her. This is scientific based companion planting.
Yes.
So here we go.
So if you came here because Wayne was going to be the speaker, I'm sorry. Plant partners or companion planting. And the South Dakota Extension Master Gardeners and Missouri Valley Master Gardeners work along with the Seed Library to give you these presentations. Okay, is it myth or is it science? And as Shan said, you know, there's a lot of old wives' tales out there, and maybe you even have some of your own where well, I planted this by this and I had the best crop ever, so I'm going to continue doing that. And sometimes that works, but there are now people that are actually doing research on this. So for a long time, it's just been, you know, word of mouth and that type of thing. So what's the myth? Well, there are several. One is anthropomorphism, which is giving human characteristics to non-human organisms. And so when we say carrots love tomatoes, there are no, you know, romantic connections there. Sensitive crystals was a popular thing in the 1930s, where there was one man who ground up the plants, extracted the juices from the plants, and he did chromatography on them, which I'm not going to go into a long detail of that, but it separates out the different chemicals that are in something. And he said that plants are attracted by their crystalline extracts. And to find out whether they were attracted to each other or not, he looked at what color these extracts were when you mixed them together. And if they were a very bright color, that meant that they were going to grow well together. And if they were a dull color, that meant probably not. But the big thing about the myths are that they really haven't done any comparison studies. So I'm sure you've done that in your own garden. You know, you happen to have really good results with something. Who knows why? But in our minds, we want to repeat that again. And so we try it again the next year. And if it keeps on working, we keep on doing it. But comparison studies are side-by-side studies to actually prove whether or not something works. Science is controlled experiments, and you have at least two parts to that experiment. You have a control group and you have an experimental group. So let's see if we really want to find out whether carrots and tomatoes are a thing that makes both of them produce more, then we might grow carrots beside tomatoes. But in order to have evidence of whether something works better than something else, we'd need to grow our carrots by something else or grow our tomatoes by something else. You would also control like the varieties of that. So you don't just plant a bunch of carrots and a bunch of tomatoes. You would want to say, I'm going to take this variety of tomatoes, and the comparison is going to be done only with that variety. And then those studies are repeated. Now, you can either repeat those studies yourself or someone else can do the same study and the same comparisons. Well, who does this? These are tested in universities, especially the land-grant universities like SDSU, at government research facilities, at nonprofit agriculture research facilities, at demonstration farms, but you can do your own research the same way. You know, just make sure that you've got the two different groups. and that you keep excellent records. So you're going to keep records of both parts of your experiment. Maybe it's going to be, if I plant my tomatoes beside carrots, how many pounds of tomatoes did I get from that plant that I planted beside the carrots, versus how many pounds of tomatoes did I get from the plant that were not anywhere near carrots. And, 1 year is not going to answer your question completely, because we know how everything varies from year to year. It could be like last year and you never get any rain. Well, that's going to skew what happens. But if the same thing happens when you have good conditions and you have poor conditions, that's probably a sign that this is something that's going to work. So what is companion planting? It's the practice of planting different crops close to each other. And the benefits of that are that it can minimize disease, it can reduce pests, it can improve soil fertility, and it can enhance pollination. Probably the best example that we know from way, way back is the one in that picture, and that's the Native Americans' Three Sisters. So the corn was the structure for the pole beans to climb. The squash down below is a ground cover that would suppress the weeds. And so by growing those three things together, the beans have a lot of nitrogen that they put into the soil that would benefit the corn plants. So, that's kind of an old tried and true one. Native Americans had been doing it for years and years and years, and many other people have tried that as well. How do plants affect each other? Well, they share resources, and they can either compete or they can share. They might maximize, the three things are water, nutrients, and sun. And so there are some interesting studies that have been done about how those interactions take place. Sharing the resources that can maximize root growth to acquire more nutrients from the soil. Sometimes the plant will grow taller, so it's got more leaf area to carry out photosynthesis. Some trees actually pull water up closer to the surface, and the small shade-loving plants that grow underneath them benefit from that extra water that they're getting by growing with the tree. They can improve nutrient availability. They alter the soil structure, making the nutrients more easier for things to get to. And legumes, of course, add nitrogen, which most plants benefit from. And then they have chemical signals. Now, chemical signals are things that they put out into the air. And it's really interesting if you have an infestation of an insect that is attacking a certain kind of plant. Those plants can send out a distress signal, which is a chemical in the air that other plants of their species pick up on. They know they're going to be attacked, and they can actually, within that plant itself, create more chemicals that are sort of something that would make them less desirable to that insect. So some of the companion planting takes advantage of that. They can also do chemical signals through the roots and the fungi, the mycorrhizal root colonies. Now, what you see in this picture, those really tiny things, way out there. Look at the size of the plant, and then look at that root structure with the fungi attached to it. So they can also send out chemical signals that way, and they can interact with other plants underground. And then allelopathy is some plants give off chemicals that are a detriment to other plants. And if you are familiar with the black walnut tree, that's one that has a chemical in the roots so that there are a lot of plants that will not grow near a black walnut tree because of that. But that protects that tree because it doesn't have competition from anything else, but it's not necessarily good for the other plants that you're trying to grow around it. So plant science is really, really interesting. I think you can see from this that even though plants can't move around, they are not passive organisms. They are very active in collecting nutrients and all these chemicals that they are able to give off. One thing that's very important in your garden is soil health. And, you know, the soil is very important for your plant growth. One thing that is being recommended more and more and more is to minimize tilling. And because tilling does a number of things. It changes the structure of the soil. And when you till, you disturb all those helpful microhyzae that are below the ground that are sending messages back and forth to the plants. You can, if you're not going to till, you can still dig holes into the soil for where you're going to plant, like your tomato plant or something, and you can scratch little rows where you're going to put seeds that you plant in rows. Adding organic matter improves the health of the soil. You can add 1 to 2 inches of mulch. That can be chopped leaves, it can be compost, it can be straw. And also adding organic matter by using cover crops, and what they call green manure is that you turn that over, that living plant material, into the soil to add nutrients to the soil. You can use legumes to add nitrogen, and if you have clay soil, which that's what we have on our farm, we have heavy clay soil. And if you till too much, you're going to turn that into concrete when it rains. But you can break up heavy soil with heavy roots. And a lot of farmers are starting to do that with cover crops put on late summer, early fall. And we'll talk more about all of these things. Okay, cover crops. I ordered some crimson clover for this year. I've never tried that before, but cover crops are non-harvested crops. We don't use them for food or anything like that. There are warm season and cool season cover crops. The warm season are the ones that you plant in the spring. Did I say that? Warm season? Yeah, plant in the spring because they're going to do their growth during the warmth of the summer. Cool season, you plant in the late summer. They overwinter, and either you mow them down in the spring or they will die over the winter, and that plant residue will stay there. So these are really good for reducing soil erosion because the roots that stay in the ground hold the soil there, so it's not going to wash away or blow away. Also, you can create habitat for beneficial insects. They like being in those cover crops. They like living in there. It adds organic matter, improves the soil structure, and suppresses weed growth. So if you've got plants growing there, then it's harder for the weeds. If you've got a lot of bare soil, that's where the weeds like to pop up. So a lot of these cover crops are actually soil conditioners, and I'm just going to go through a few of these. You may or may not have heard of all of them. Annual buckwheat. I planted this last year around my potatoes because it's supposed to deter potato bugs. And one end of my garden had a lot of potato bugs, but the other end didn't. So they were all near the buckwheat. You sow it in the spring. It is beautiful. I hated to cut it down. It was so pretty. You can't really see the little white flowers on here, but it gets little sprays of white flowers at the top. The problem is if they go to seed, they reseed readily. So you cut it down when it's flowering and just leave the plants on top of the ground. Cow peas, which you may have heard of as black-eyed peas, it depends on where you live, what the common name for them is, are sowed early in the spring because they're a legume. They add nitrogen to the soil. And again, mow these when they begin to produce flowers. Now you could pull them, but then you're taking all that root matter out of the ground, which it might be better to cut them down. The timing of your mowing is kind of important. If you mow too early, or you can clip them off with a hedge trimmer or whatever, but if you do it too early, the plant will grow back. But if you wait too long after they flower, then you've got seeds. And you really don't want your cover crops turning into weed patches. So the guideline is kind of after they're in bloom, wait about 1 week and then cut them down. Crimson clover is also a legume. Plant this one in the late summer, leave it for winter mulch, but this is one that will reseed. So once those flowers have been there for about a week, go in there, cut it down, mow it, whatever you have. You know, if you were planting things between corn rows, you could probably get in there with a lawnmower and mow them down. Other places, if your garden is full of plants, that may not work. Oats, spring plant for a living mulch. This will not overwinter because it freezes back. And you can plant directly into the dead plant debris the following spring because the oats is not going to grow back. This is also allelopathic. So there are weeds that will not grow well if you plant it into oat stubble. Winter rye. This one I tried last year, so we'll see how it works this year because this is sown in the fall and you cut it down in the spring. This is very allelopathic. In fact, our neighbors have been planting winter rye, and he said he had hardly any weeds in his field the next year that he planted soybeans into. So, I mean, it's a way that you can avoid some of those horrible chemicals that we use for weed control. I planted the winter rye into my asparagus because I always have problems with weeds in the asparagus. And so as soon as I was done harvesting asparagus, I planted the winter rye in there, watered it, it came up beautifully. And when I took my asparagus plants down this fall, there really were very few weeds in there, but that's supposed to carry through into this spring. So I'm anxious to see how well that works. Again, you can plant the transplants right into the residue. Now, being a winter rye, this will come back in the spring. So if you don't want it to make seed, that's when you mow it down. I was at International Master Gardeners in Pennsylvania, and we went to the Pennsylvania Experiment Farm, and they had a whole field that they had planted to winter rye. They mowed it down that spring, and when we were there, they had the whole thing planted into pumpkins. So they planted their pumpkins right into that rye stubble because it's going to keep the weeds down. Winter wheat is like winter rye in that you plant it late in the summer or in the fall, and you mow it down in the spring so you don't get seed heads. This one is a great soil insulator. So it keeps your soil from doing that heaving from the freezing and thawing. And again, you can plant Vine crops particularly work well in this, right into that stubble. Because once you mow it down, the stubble's not going. Okay, so those are soil conditioners. Nitrogen transfer partners, legumes are the ones that, they get those little nodules on their roots and they take nitrogen out of the air and they store it in those little nodules. And so they're actually adding nitrogen from the air into the soil, which is a fertilizer that a lot of plants like. So that's how this improves soil fertility. So this is garden beans, work well to add nutrients for potatoes. Cowpeas for peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants, those solanaceous plants that are all in the same family. Peas grow well with lettuce, particularly when you plant the lettuce right in with the peas. And edamame, which are actually soybeans where you eat the pod before the bean itself is mature, work really well with fall greens. And the reason these work together is because the beans, the peas, and, soybeans, edamame, they are all legumes which add that nitrogen to the soil that these other plants need. Breaking up heavy soils, things with thick roots. And the top one is a radish. Now, this isn't your little round spring radish. This is like a daikon radish, and they get about that big around and about that long. So you can imagine that they really make a big space in your soil. And a lot of the cover crops that farmers are using have both the radishes and the turnips in them. And they the radishes do rot over the winter. And so you can just go out in the field and see all these holes in there. Mm-hmm. And the turnips, we had a whole field full of these. The turnips really didn't completely die out over the winter. So they were some of them were acting like a biennial, where they would shoot out leaves in the spring. But these really aerate the soil, and they also are good for opening up your soil so that moisture can get down in there and help break up that real hard clay soil. Buckwheat does not have a huge root, but it has a pretty long root. And that's one of the reasons that buckwheat is helpful in breaking up heavy soils. And yeah, you can put these in your garden, and they could stay there in the wintertime. We loved those turnips out in the field. We would go out and pick a 5-gallon pail of turnips. So we were not leaving the turnips there to help the soil, but we really enjoyed them. They are edible, the forage.
We use turnips in food plots.
Yeah.
Deer just love them. It's candy to them.
So they might be a problem in your garden then, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Weed management, when you've got plants growing, that means other plants are less likely to grow there. And so living mulches are a really good thing to help control weeds. Annual mulch with annuals. Now, what I mean by that is an annual is a plant that does its whole life cycle in one season. They would flower, they would have fruit, they would have seeds and everything in one season. So plant a mulch that is an annual with things that are annuals in the garden. For example, corn would be an annual. So if you're putting a mulch in there, use an annual mulch. A perennial mulch is that one that will come back year after year. And if you're going to have perennials in your garden, you can plant perennial mulches around them that just come back year after year after year. When you're planting mulches, consider the plant height. You don't want your mulches to get so tall that they shade the vegetables that you're putting in your garden. So do some research on that and find out how tall. The other thing is they can be clipped. You know, most of them will come back before they flowered. You can alternate the rows with vegetables. And that would be, yeah, like using for walking paths, using around your raised beds, you know, where you walk between your raised beds. You can put these cover crops in there. You could sow short ones directly under tall crops. And you can continue to mow or cut them back so that they don't get too big or too tall. Pest management, that was one of the positives of companion planting since forever, was to try to plant something next to a plant that really is insect susceptible, that deters that insect in some way. So the methods for that are trap cropping, masking or hiding the host plant, in some way interfere with egg laying. If they're not going to be able to lay eggs, then you're not going to get a new crop of insects. To physically prevent those pests from getting to your plants. And improving plant diversity, we're hearing more and more about that all the time, how these monocultures are not a good thing. You have only one kind of plant. It's not good from a standpoint of nutrients in the soil, what they use and what they put in the soil. And it's really not good for insects, because if insects find, you know, you've got a garden this size and it's mostly tomatoes, well, they're going to find the tomatoes and they like that. So there's a cabbage looper and the immature and mature stages of the potato beetle. Trap plants are sacrificial plants that you are willing to let get infested with insects, and then you destroy the insects. But you keep it from getting to the crops that you really want. Now, you want to plant them a little earlier. And a good example here is the blue Hubbard squash. That is a favorite of squash bugs and the squash maggot, you know, that attacks the root. They love blue Hubbard squash. I generally don't have trouble with those insects. I am not going to plant blue Hubbard squash in my garden because I don't want them to come in there. But you could plant it farther away. Now, we've had volunteer squash that grew up in the lot that the cattle walk through, you know, away from the garden, and they never seem to bother the squash. They just walk around them. So I could plant a blue Hubbard out there and let those insects destroy that squash so they don't bother the ones in my garden. You can either use those chemicals to kill the bugs. You can use a wet dry vacuum cleaner to vacuum those bugs up, or you can pull the plant that the bugs have destroyed, and then they're not, you know, there in the quantity to bother your other plants. So you want to plant them ahead of your desired plants. If you're going to plant a blue Hubbard squash, plant it like a week or a week and a half prior to the squash that you are going to want, so they find that plant and they stay with that plant. If you are planting trap crops, plant away from your desired vegetables if you have pests that are mobile. So plant pests that can fly, like moths, which lay their eggs on all of your cold crops. So don't plant your trap crop right there with them. You can interplant for pests that are not very mobile, like aphids, because then they'll attack the trap plant, but they can't fly to the other plants. to bother those. So here's some good trap partners. If your pest is a flea beetle, they love radishes and shinies, mustard, and you will keep them away from your tomatoes or your beans. These are flea beetles. Squash bugs, I've talked about that. Here's that gray squash bug, and there is the moth that lays the eggs on the base of your squash plants that turns into a caterpillar that burrows into the stems and kills off your squash plant. Pepper maggots. Hot cherry peppers are a trap plant. So in other words, these maggots like the hot peppers better than they like the sweet peppers. So you plant hot peppers that they can destroy so they don't bother your others. And aphids like sunflowers, and they attract aphids for that helps almost any kind of plant. I had some sunflowers in my squash, my cucumbers and my squash and that type of thing. And I had so many aphids on those sunflowers that they just dropped all this honeydew onto my other plants. And I decided, no, I don't want them in there. So now I plant the sunflowers at the edge of the garden so the aphids attack it there and they don't leave all that yuck on my other plants. Another one is masking or hiding the plants that you want to preserve so that the insects can't find them. If you look at the top picture there, one of the things we don't want to do is leave large areas of ground because a lot of insects will live in that ground then. And then you've got a weed problem, but you've also got an insect problem. In the bottom picture, that's where all of this interplanting has been done. And you can see all the flowers that are in there amongst the different vegetables. So intercropping is planting diverse species in close proximity to each other. And that goes for, the insects we were talking about, but other things as well. Plant both vegetables and flowers and plant them together. Flowers are wonderful for pollinators and they're pretty. So what are masking partners? A lot of them have fragrances, strong odors that the insects don't like. So if you have aphids, mask plants are onions and garlic. And plant that near peppers because peppers are susceptible to aphids. And if you've got onions and garlic right around them, they don't like that smell, so they stay away. Squash bugs. The plant partner, the one you want to protect is the zucchini. You can plant nasturtiums around your zucchini. And they do have a stronger odor that the insects don't like as well. These are aphids, thrips, and that tomato plant there has been damaged by thrips. Thrips are pretty small. You might not notice them as an insect on your plants, but you can usually see the damage. So thrips don't like basil, another strong smelling plant. Plant basil by your tomatoes if you don't want thrips to bother your tomatoes. Potato beetles, the mask plant is tansy or catmint, and they protect the potatoes from potato beetles. Use cover crops in there, as a way of not having all that bare ground. Now, another thing you can do with the insects is impede their egg laying, so make it difficult to lay eggs. And you can use row crop covers and things like that, especially over the cole crops seem to attract a lot of different kinds of insects. And if the insect cannot get to the plant, they can't lay an egg. But you want to make landing on the host plant difficult. And one thing you want to do is separate plants of the same species. Let's see if I can. There, in that top one, see, long row of cabbage. The cabbage is all right there. The little yellow butterflies come along to lay their eggs, and they land and they land and they land, and they just go down there and lay their eggs along the whole row. That makes it really easy for them. So if you make it more difficult, by separating the plants of the same species, they don't want to work that hard. And so they might land on one, and they don't always lay eggs on the first plant they land on. So they might land on one, and then they go looking for another one, but it's not right there. They have to work to find another plant to lay their eggs on. Cover that bare soil with mulch and plant herbs and flowers around there. They might not like the smell, or maybe they like the herb or the flower. So to keep them from laying eggs for the cabbage worm, they don't like sage, dill, or thyme, so you can plant that around your cole crops. Hornworms, which are a problem with tomatoes, don't like basil, so basil next to your tomatoes will help prevent those. Army worms don't like thyme and basil, and again, that helps out your tomatoes. Root maggots don't like marigolds, and they help protect onions and cabbage from maggots in their roots. So there's sage, thyme, and marigolds. Impede pest movement. So you're actually creating barriers so that the insects can't get to the plant as easily. Now, if you've traveled in Europe, they've got hedgerows everywhere. We generally don't do that in the United States. And it may be something that doesn't interest you because hedgerows are more or less permanent. So you put them in there and they keep the insects. They have to fly up and over these plants before they can get to yours. And they're generally shrubs and grasses. So echinacea, elderberry, serviceberry, sunflowers would be an annual. You could, put them in every year if you wanted to. And switchgrass is another one. And then low-growing cover crops are planted. They stay real short, and they make it so that the insects that are trying to crawl around on the ground can't get to the plants as easily. Another thing that's really, really important is diverse planting. So plant all kinds of things together. If Wayne were here, he could show you pictures of his garden. That's exactly how he plants it. There are no rows. There are like islands, and each island will have, a variety of plants in it. You could easily do that with your raised beds. You'll have each raised bed be its own little island of diverse plants that are going to help each other out. Now, these are not meant to be across from each other. They're just lists. Pest-eating insects, that's what you want. You want those beneficial insects in your garden because they will eat other insects like ladybugs and aphids. Ground beetles, those are the little black beetles about that big around that just crawl around on the ground. Believe it or not, they eat a lot of insects and insect eggs. Lacewings, that's this left one. A syrphid fly or hoverfly is the middle one. That's not a bee, it's a fly. Ladybugs, parasitic wasps. They lay eggs in the caterpillars of other insects, and then those eggs, when they hatch, the little insects eat the caterpillars. Plant attractors for these are anything in the carrot family. Dill, anything in the mint family, but mint family is notorious for spreading. If you're afraid of it spreading, you could put your mint plants in pots and set them in your garden, because then the roots aren't going to spread out. Lacey Facelia, that is this one on the right there, and Sweet Alyssum. All of those attract beneficial insects to your garden. And so if you're going to have insects in there, have the ones that are going to work for you and help you out. Buying ladybugs or mantids, which you can do, is not usually helpful, because when you release them, if what they prey on is not in your garden, they're going to fly somewhere else and look for it. So they're not necessarily, you've spent the $15 for a carton of ladybugs, and they all leave and go to wherever the aphids might be. They don't stay in your garden just because you put them there. So why plant with diversity? Especially flowering plants attract pollinators. And you know, those vegetables that we have in our garden, before we have vegetables, there's flowers. And the flowers need to be pollinated, so something's got to be there. Not everything is wind pollinated. Corn is wind pollinated, but a lot of your other plants are not. So some good insects are bumblebees, squash bees. Those are the little bees that you see inside your squash flowers. They like squash. That's their favorite. Sweat bees, we have lots and lots of native bees that we do not even know how many we have. And a lot of them you might mistake for flies. A lot of them are real tiny, like 1/4 of an inch. So it's not the honeybees that are doing the majority of the pollinating. It's actually the native bees that do the majority of it. Butterflies and moths, and also hummingbirds will pollinate, because they've got their head right into the flowers all the time. So what are some plants that attract these pollinators? Bachelor buttons, borage. This is borage in the left picture. It's a pretty tall herb. It has these pretty little blue flowers that are edible. They taste like cucumber. So you could put those flowers into your ice cubes and put them into your drink and get a mild cucumber flavor from them. Basil, chives, sunflowers, and zinnias are all attractants for pollinators. So plant them in and among everything else. So, some books. These are some older ones, 2014, 1988, and they have lists in them. These are not necessarily scientifically based, but they are beyond grandma said this. And so they have, this one is written, Carrots Love Tomatoes. It says, for example, watermelon. And it tells you what to plant around watermelon. So it has lists of plants. So does this one, companion planting. And this one has a good neighbor and a bad neighbor section. So maybe there's a plant that doesn't get along well with other plants because of the chemicals that the roots emit and so on. This is the book I would recommend. The Missouri Valley Master Gardeners have ordered this for the library. I have no idea if it's still here, but this is the newest. This is Plant Partners, written in 2020, totally based on science. So everything in this book has been tested and proven. And there's not nearly as many plants in here because they haven't tested them all yet. So we'll probably see more books by this author or this type of book in the future. So, any questions?
Potato bugs.
Yeah, there's lots of things you can try with potato bugs. With, what you plant by them, or even that cover crop, the buckwheat as a cover crop right around the potatoes. So,
I planted winter rye as a cover crop, maybe just 2 winters ago, 2 falls ago. Timing is real important in getting that going. I waited too long. I still hadn't harvested squash and other things. And when I finally got it in, it did germinate. And we had one of those long falls, and I was real hopeful. Then we got a major cold period and no snow cover.
oh yeah,
And it really injured it. It came back a little bit in the spring, but
Yeah.
it was more of a nuisance then.
yeah, that's where, if you get away from planting things in rows, then it's easier to plant those cover crops just here and there. But both winter wheat and winter rye will winter kill without snow cover, especially if it gets cold. So, but I'm anxious to see what my asparagus patch looks like this spring.
Anything take care of creeping June?
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, yeah,
I need to listen to
yeah.
this.
That one, yeah.
They are really hard to get rid of because if you don't get the whole root out, which you never will, every little section of root that is still under the ground will sprout. Other than chemicals, the recommendation is to cover them up so they get no sunlight, with layers of newspaper or cardboard with inches of grass on top of it, wet down so it doesn't blow away, so that they don't get any sunlight. You could also try clear plastic weighted down around. Wind's always a problem with that stuff here. Clear plastic will heat the ground and the plant up to the point where it can't grow. So if you put clear plastic on there, weight down the edges, and leave it there for a period of time, those are your best non-chemical options. But they are nasty. That's why they're called a noxious weed.
Your slides, you mentioned elderberry. I was just wondering if anybody has experience with it here. I ordered some cuttings. I was hoping they'd come in a few weeks. They came this week. And they're small, but they said there's some earth. They're in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna get them potted soon and indoors, but I'm doing it as pretty much as a hedgerow or a hedge.
Mm-hmm.
For some wind protection. One side of my garden isn't protected. And I have pollinator strip on one side and some old historic hedges on the others. But I was just wondering if anybody has any experience with elderberry.
We did, I think we got ours, we dug them up from an existing, plot
Yeah.
of elderberry. And it took probably 3 or 4 years before they bloomed, got to where they produced. And we had to completely fence them over top and sides because the deer would just eat them to the ground every year. That's the only way.
What about the birds? Don't they like the berries too?
They do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do not like grandpa's.
So they attract all kinds of
Oh, yeah,
wildlife.
bugs, butterflies, bees, anything, but, once they get going, I think they're pretty hard to, kill
They're
out.
beautiful when they bloom, and they're really prolific as far as producing fruit, right?
Well, that sounds good.
But, yeah, it started protected because rabbits are here.
Rabbits, I mean,
Yeah. question?
How do I get rid of pocket gophers?
Yes.
Get a badger. We had pocket gophers, we had an alfalfa field right beside my garden. And the pocket gophers were coming in there and every night in a row, they'd have a new mound. And one morning we came out to the garden and the holes were all dug up. It was a badger had gotten in there and killed every pocket gopher.
Yes.
Cool.
So, yes, that was cool.
One thing to put into there that is definitely organic, but some people won't think that they want this to happen, is if you put obviously unchewed juicy fruit gum, take off the wrapper and use gloves to put it into the tunnel, they eat that and they cannot digest it.
My problem is they do the mounds,
Uh-huh.
and I've never been able to find the hole.
Oh, you just take a rod.
Cats kill them. Barn cats will kill them.
Oh, ours don't. Our
They
cats
fight
are
hard
lazy.
to kill them, but they do.
It's,
Yeah.
one
If
lady
they
said
come
to
up.
me, but I feel bad that I'm giving them bowel obstruction. I don't feel too bad. I'm still not to that point where I feel bad about that.
Well, that would be
Because
one
the thing-
disadvantage to having all these permanent cover crops, because that's what the pocket gophers like. They, if you're digging it up, like where my husband plants corn, we've never got pocket gophers, but where there's alfalfa, something like that, the roots stay in the ground year after year, then pocket gophers do like that.
And I no longer get distressed when my dog eats baby bunnies.
Yeah.
They're nasty, eat them all.
That's the cats do
And
that. I
nasturtiums,
used to feel bad.
rabbits do not like nasturtiums. They go up, smell it, and they back off and never come back.
What don't they like?
Nasturtium.
Nasturtiums? Hate rabbits.
One thing I do, and I didn't do it for gardening, I feed birds.
Yeah.
And, you have resident birds, you got migratory birds twice a year coming through, but I don't stop feeding until early summer. And when my vegetable garden's coming up, there's bare spaces in there, and I just sit out there, and just watch these birds hammering insects.
Mhm.
So it's just something I enjoy seeing them
Me too.
all year. But I think they do a job on some of the, I wish they did a better job on the cucumber beetles.
Yeah.
We do have some birds down there.
Well, thanks for coming. I
Thank
hope you
you.
learned something.
Yes, thank
Sorry
you.
I'm not Wayne.